Hi, it's Jeanette McKenzie. Welcome to Part 4 of the PM Benchmark Reading Assessment Resource Training. So let's look at where we've been. In Workshop 1, we had an introduction to the PM Benchmark Assessment Kit. Your assignment for Workshop 1 was to familiarize yourself with the components within the kit and the teacher's resource. In Workshop 2, we looked at how to use the assessment tools. Your assignment for this workshop was to use the assessment tools with 1 or 2 students in your class. In Workshop 3, we looked at how to analyze the assessment data that you collected using all of the assessment tools. Your homework for this session was to take a look at analyzing the data for one of your own students. Where are we going? In Workshop 4, we're going to look at how do we use that assessment data to plan for everyday instruction in the classroom. The important thing about using the PM Benchmark assessment tools is that it provides you with the information you need to be strategic in taking action to help your students. The assessment tools in the PM Benchmark Kit will give you a clear indication of the student's control of vocabulary, their use of sentence structures, concepts, and the use of skills and strategies to gain understanding. So how does the assessment data help plan for instruction? Well, first of all, it will give you an indication of the instructional reading level, which will help you select text that you're going to use for both guided reading and independent reading. It will also identify the student's reading strengths and identify where the student needs further instruction and practice. One of the first things we'll need to do for planning for instruction in our classroom is to identify the appropriate level of text required by the student. In order to do this, we need to look at the accuracy rate and the comprehension of the student. If the student is scoring 90 to 95% in terms of word recognition, then most likely this material is at the instructional level. In other words, this is text that provides the student with some challenges, but not so many challenges that the student becomes frustrated. If the student is scoring more than 95% in accuracy, you need to take a look at 2 things. One, if they're scoring more than 95% accuracy and they're reading with understanding, then the student is ready to move on to the next level. And this is an important element of looking at at the student's data. You really need to take a look at, yes, the accuracy level that you obtain from doing the reading record, but it's critical that you look at the student's retelling and comprehension. And the reason for that being that there are some students who are very good word readers. In other words, they can decode text with more than 95% accuracy. But when we ask them to retell or ask them the comprehension questions, we realize that the student cannot actually comprehend or understand the text. So if a student is reading at 95% accuracy, is reading at more than 95% accuracy, and they've demonstrated that they have clear understanding of the text, then that student is ready to move on to the next level. If, however, the student achieves more than 95% accuracy, but the retelling and comprehension question indicates that the student lacks depth and understanding, then the student should really continue with text at this level and have more explicit instruction in the comprehension and retelling aspect. So let's work through an example of selecting the appropriate level of text for this student. So when I look at page 1 of the student record form, we look at the reading level for this particular student, and we notice that the student is reading at 95% accuracy, and that falls into the instructional reading level. So we know that level 12 is the appropriate level for this student in terms of their accuracy rate. However, as we stated in the next slide, we also need to look at the student's retelling and comprehension. So when we continue to look at page 1 of the student record form, we look at the retelling and we notice that the student falls into the satisfactory level. So they got a 3 in terms of that. So that's still within range for the student retelling. And we're also going to look at the comprehension, and we notice that the student's comprehension, when we look at the summary, is 5 or excellent. So we've examined the retelling, we've examined the student's comprehension and the student accuracy level, and they all fall within that 90 to 95% range. So that tells us that texts at level 12 are appropriate for this student. So now you're ready to select appropriate text for your students' independent reading and for your students' guided reading. So remember, guided reading is at the instructional level. So for the student we just looked at, we're looking at text for guided reading. That's at level 12. So we know that the texts that are in your classroom library or texts that are in your book room may use different leveling systems. So what we've provided for you here on this leveling chart that's available at the website listed below, or on the back cover of your Nelson K-9 catalog, is a chart that will show you the equivalency for various reading series. So for example, our student that we looked at, looking at the PM level, required a book that was at the level 12 range. So if you happen to have books that are leveled using Fountas and Pinnell guided reading levels, you'd be looking for a book in the G or H level. If you happen to be working with books that use a color system, such as key links, you'd be looking for books that would be in the blue-green range. So it doesn't really matter what type of book you have and what type of leveling system it uses. You can look at the equivalency chart and find a book that's in the level 12 range. Some examples of level text that would be appropriate for guided reading and independent reading might include things such as the PM Library, the Nelson Literacy Guided Reading Kits, or Key Links. We'll talk a little bit more about these later in this workshop and in other workshop series. We have now identified the reading level of text required for instructional purposes, in other words, for guided reading. So now we need to take a look at what does the student need during that guided reading time? In other words, what strength did the student bring to the text and what are their needs? And we find out this information by reviewing what we've summarized on page 1 of the student record form. So we'll look at the reading record, we'll look at what kind of miscues the student was making, we'll look at a summary of their reading behaviors, the retelling indicators, and the comprehension questions. And this information will tell us what we need to do to support the student as they grow further in their reading ability. So let's take a look at this particular student. When we look at what the student did in terms of the reading record, in terms of the retelling, the reading behaviors, and the comprehension, then we look at what recommendations would we make for this student. So this particular teacher has said, what does this student need going forward? So we notice that the teacher said that the student needed continued guided instruction of level 12, and their emphasis is on the fluency with which the student is reading. So we saw earlier that this student was reading 95% accuracy at level 12. But in the teacher notes, we can see that the student was not reading with the fluency that would be expected at this level. So we would be then reinforcing fluency or teaching for fluency. We also notice that this teacher has recommended that the teacher themselves needs to model how to apply knowledge of letter-sound relationships to decode. They also need to reinforce cross-checking strategies and the importance of searching for print details. So if you recall what we looked at back in video 3, we talked a lot about cross-checking. So in other words, we said that the students typically, especially at the early levels, tend to rely on either reading using meaning cues or reading using visual cues. And by cross-checking, we're asking the student to integrate those strategies. We also see that the teacher is talking about implementing a variety of activities to reinforce instant word recognitions of the high frequency words and to focus on how to include details when retelling. So this is the teacher's summary of what this student needs going forward. So the instruction that the teacher will plan for this student, both through guided reading and through other activities in the classroom, will be how do I build on the strengths that this student has and teach for and practice the things that the student needs, such as fluency, such as cross-checking, better recognition of high-frequency words. And you can see the link between better recognition of high-frequency words with fluency. So when a student has to pause to figure out words, particularly high-frequency words, it affects their fluency. So automatic recognition of high-frequency words will be something that will help the student. So what you need to be doing in terms of what you've done with your student records is then take the time to examine all the data you've collected about your student, and then to write at the bottom, what are your recommendations? In other words, what did I notice that the student really was not using in terms of their reading, or that they had an area of weakness? And you'll write the recommendations there, because that's where your future instruction will take place. Based on the teacher's recommendations for future development in the student that we saw in the previous slides, we noted that one of the recommendations the teacher made was that the student needed to have further practice automatically recognizing high-frequency words. So if we look on pages 33 to 39, and we look at levels 6 to 14, so remembering that this student is reading at level 12, we notice that there are suggestions for teaching students high-frequency words. So for instance, it says we might have students recall high-frequency words by rereading PM text or other texts at relevant levels. So one of the ways they become aware of high-frequency words is by meeting them frequently in other texts. Just a little note here that by rereading texts at relevant levels, this doesn't mean rereading the text in the PM Benchmark kit. These texts are only used for assessment purposes, but reading other texts at the same levels. You'll also notice that it has some instructional practices here. So we would want to teach the student to do things like distinguishing between high-frequency words that tend to look the same, they, them, then. They might look for common sounds and spelling patterns. So it does give you some ideas of things that you can do to help the student strengthen these particular areas in their reading. So let's just take a look at another example. We'll look at one more example of recommendations for future development for the student we looked at in the previous slides. One of the recommendations that the teacher made was helping the student to use cross-checking when reading. And so you'll see on this page, focused on levels 16 to 14, the guidelines for teaching strategies. You'll notice at the bottom of the page that it does give some suggestions for teaching cross-checking. So it might be teaching the student to use cross-checking using letter sound knowledge when the meaning breaks down, or doing things like self-monitoring by saying, something didn't sound right, I think I'll try that again. So these are the kinds of prompts and strategies we want to work with on this particular student when we're working in small guided reading groups. So we really want to find out two things when we are looking at the student record form. One, what level of instruction or text do they need? And that's fairly easy to figure out, as we looked at in the last few slides. The second thing we really want to look at is what kind of instruction do they need? So we really want to look at the kinds of errors the student's making. So are they making meaning errors, visual errors, or structural errors? And we need to note that two students might have exactly the same score. In other words, they might need the same level of text, but the things we're doing for instruction for those students may be very different. So if you take a look at the text that I'm showing you on this page, so this is level 9, Clever Little Dinosaur, and we're just going to work with a little piece of text. So if you look at the picture on this page, little dinosaur came out of his hole. I can't see big dinosaur today, he said. I'll go for a walk. I'll go down to the river. We're going to work with only the first little bit of text. So if we look at these two students, student A and student B, and the kinds of errors you're seeing would be indicative of the errors that the student made throughout reading this book. Let's look at student A. So student A said, little dinosaur came out of his home. I'll go out for a walk. I will go down to the river. So notice that this student had a substitution. They said home for whole, and they said I will go out, so they inserted the word out for a walk. The second student, student B, said, little dinosaur can out of his hole. I will go for a want. I will go down to the river. So this student made two substitutions. They said can for came and want for walk. So let's look at what each of these students is doing. So what kind of cues is student A using, and what kind of cues is student B using? So let's look at student A. When we take a look at the cues that student A is doing, you'll notice that when the student said little dinosaur came out of his home, that home makes sense there from a meaning perspective. It also works from a structural perspective. So can we say it like that? Yes, we can say it like that. It sounds right. Did the student use visual cues? Yes. If you look at home and whole, they both start out the same way. So from a perspective of looking at the analysis, the student is really using all three cueing systems. However, when I look at what they did in terms of visual cues, I would note that this student is using is using a visual cue, but they're only looking at the first part of the word. They're looking at the H and the O, and they're not looking through to the end of the word. When the student says, I will go out for a walk, when I take a look at that, they are using a meaning cue there, and they are using a structure cue. What they're not using is a visual cue, because that word does not actually even appear on the page. But overall, this is a student who's reading for meaning. So what they're reading makes sense. Now let's look at student B. When student B says, little dinosaur can out of his hole, or I will go for a want, we notice that this student is likely using visual cues. Can and came start off the same way. Want and walk have a similar look to them. But this student's reading is very different than student A. This student is not really reading for meaning. So if you say, I will go for a want, that doesn't really make sense. So when you look at these two students, you realize that they really need very different instruction. Student A, reading for meaning. Student B, struggling with meaning and also to some degree structure. So what does student A need? Student A needs two things. One, more focus on the visual. So this is a student who needs to attend to medial and ending structure of words. And this is also a student who needs to focus on one-to-one matching. So in other words, when they're inserting words, we need to have them put their finger under each word and read each word, and then they'll see that obviously that word out could not fit in. So when this student is reading in small group guided reading, I'd want to focus on one-to-one matching and reading through to the end of the word to make sure that the whole visual appearance of that word matches. Student B, on the other hand, needs much more focus on meaning, and likely this student's comprehension was breaking down, because when they read words like want instead of walk, the text does not make sense to them. So for this student, I would likely try a lower reading level, because their inability to accurately decode those words was really affecting meaning. So you can see that even though these two students would have scored, because they had the same number of errors, they would have scored exactly the same in terms of the kind of text they needed. When I started to take a look at their errors and then to look at their comprehension and retelling, I'll see that they need very different instruction. So it's important that we look at not just the reading level, but what does the student need in terms of what I'm going to provide for them in terms of instructional practices. So let's take a look at student A. And again, I'm only showing you a very small piece of this student reading record. But when we look at what this student is doing, and I look at their use of whole and home, I realize that the student for sure is looking at beginning letters, maybe even ending letters, but perhaps not looking through to the medial letters, the letters in the middle. So what would be the kinds of prompts I'd want to be using with this student? Not while you're taking the reading record for the PM Benchmark kit. We're now talking about how you've taken that data and you're using this in your everyday instruction with the student. So when this student is reading, and we're working in small guided reading groups, and they're reading words like home instead of whole, I would need to be using certain prompts with this student. So in the small guided reading group, I would be saying things like, the word home here would make sense. And it does. So if you recall back to the picture we looked at, the dinosaur was walking out of his hole or his home. So I'd say to the student, you know, the word home would make sense here. It starts the same with the same letter as home. But if it were home, what letters would you expect to see at the end? And you can see my prompt. I'm making the student look through to the end of the word. So I'm saying to the student, look past the beginning of the word. If it were really home, what would you expect to see at the end? And the student would likely say, I'd expect to see M at the end, the sound. And I'd say, what letter do you see? And they would say, I see L-E. So now let's try it again. And that's the kind of prompting I would be constantly giving to a student who's not looking through to the end of a word, who's really only looking at the beginning of the word. So what is an instructional strategy that I might be employing with student B? So when we take a look at student B's reading, we notice that the student said can for came and want for walk, neither of which really is getting at meaning of text. So with this student, I might say, when we're in small guided reading groups, use prompts that are similar to the ones I'm going to talk about. So I might say to the student, you said little dinosaur can out of his hole. and I'd point to the word came, and I would say, did that make sense? What word would make sense here and starts like this? So I want to point out that they were using their visual cues. The word can and came were starting out the same way, but it didn't really make sense here. So I'm going to ask them, what word can you think of that would make sense here that starts the same as can? And then I might let them give it a try. Or I might say to them, what is there in the picture that might help you? And when we took a look at the picture, they did notice that the dinosaur was coming out of his hole, or coming out of the hole in the cave. So we want to use these kinds of prompts that eventually the student embeds themselves. So the student really eventually starts to say to themselves, did that word I just say make sense? If it was that word, would it start like that and make sense here? So we want to constantly use these instructional prompts when we're in small guided reading groups to focus on whatever the area of weakness is. So you saw in student A that we were really very much focused on the student reading through to the end of the word, but what we were not focused on meaning, because that student is already reading for meaning. This student, on the other hand, is not reading for meaning, and so we really need to be focused with this student on constantly saying to them, did that make sense? What else could you try here that starts the same as the word that you read? We need to remember that the importance of instruction in small guided reading groups is to provide students with the strategies they need to get through complex text or text that presents new or difficult ideas. What we don't want is for the student just to give up and say, I can't figure it out. So our role as teachers is to provide them with that strategy instruction when eventually the student embeds using visual cues, meaning cues, and structural cues to aid them in the decoding as they read. When we're working in small guided reading groups, we want to be teaching the instructional strategies, and we do this through prompting the students. Eventually, we want the students to embed this thinking so they automatically use the cueing systems. So for instance, we might, when we're looking at helping the student who's challenged to make meaning when they're reading, we might use consistent prompts such as, you said, substitute the word, you said, does that make sense? We might say, what could you try here that would make sense? We might say, what do you know that might help? And this might help them, this might be them using their prior knowledge, it might be looking at the picture, so something that's going to help them make sense. But what's really critical here is that we use these prompts consistently, so we don't change the way we're saying them. So we'll always say, you said, does that make sense? What could you try that would make sense here? So we want to make sure that we're consistently using the same prompts. If we're going to be using a prompt for a student who's struggling with structure, we would always say to the student, you said, does that sound right? Because this is where we're focusing on the structure of the English language. And by the way, this is the most challenging in many ways to teach to the student is the structure of the English language. Really the only way you begin to understand whether something sounds right is by hearing the English language over and over again. And that's why it's so important in our classrooms that we have a lot of oral language going on, we do a lot of read-alouds and a lot of shared reading. Students need to know how the English language sounds before they know if it sounds right. We might want to use prompts to help the student who's really working with a visual cue. So this is a student who needs prompting to look at the visual cues. So we might be saying things to the student like, you said, what would you expect to see at the beginning of whatever that word is? We might say something like, do you see something in that word that can help you? So this is where we might be looking for letter sounds that go together. We might be looking at ways we could chunk words. If we have students who are not attending to the number of words in text, in other words, they're omitting or adding words, we might say to the student a prompt such as, read it with your finger. Did you have enough words? Did you have too many words? And so we want to consistently use these same prompts over and over again. In fact, in many classrooms that I work in, when the students are doing partner reading sometimes, I'll hear them say this to each other. So in other words, when one student gets stuck on a word, I'll often hear the other student say to them something like, look at the picture, what do you think it looks like? Or they'll say, Did that make sense, that word? How did that word start? So students begin to use those prompts with each other, but the whole point of it is to be consistent in prompts. And I would suggest to you that you might form a list of prompts that you're going to use. Keep it on hand when you're in your small guided reading groups, when you're reading with students one-on-one. And use these prompts consistently across your school, and if possible, consistently across your board. We want to really teach students to be using the prompts, in other words, embedding the use of strategies. So we want students to always be thinking to themselves, did what I just read make sense? Did it sound right? Did it look right? And importantly, where did my understanding begin to break down? In other words, when I was reading, where did it really stop making sense to me? Because this is when I want to engage in self-correcting. So I'm going to give you some examples of prompts that students might be using. So for instance, and you might post these as anchor charts in your classroom that the students could be referring to when they're working with reading. So for example, we might have prompts that are about the picture. So we might be getting students to say to themselves, do I see any clues in the picture? Does this word make sense with the picture? We could provide them with clues about structure. So in other words, does that sound right? What's another word that would fit here that looks right and makes sense? Or does it make sense? What would help me understand this text? So what do I already know about the topic? How could the picture help me? Posting prompts such as, does it look right? So these are the prompts that are about the visual cues. So for instance, what's the first letter or sound of the word? And we'll often say to the student, look at the first letter, get your lips ready to say that word. What sound does that letter or combination of letter make? What other words start with that letter, and what word would fit into that sentence? Can sounding out each letter help me read the word? And you know, for many of our students, this is a common strategy, and a common strategy that our parents tell them, sound it out. So it's really important that we realize and help our students understand there's a lot more ways to figure out reading other than just sounding it out. So I'm not going to go through all of those prompts, but it just gives you some examples of prompts that you can post on anchor charts for students to use when they're reading. And if you have a small guided reading group that you've got a group of students who are really focused on needing to look at visual cues, then you might have these posted at your little guided reading group, and you could be referring to these as the reading's happening. So early in September, and we're a little bit past September now, but early in September, what we want to do is we want to assess so that we can identify the student's instructional level. This will tell us what level of text do I need for classroom use. We will identify the student's strengths and their areas of need. And both of those things will allow us to develop the instruction that we need to put into place to help those students achieve success. So we've now identified the reading level. So in other words, what level of text does a student need? We've examined what the student's strengths are and what their areas of weakness are. And we've developed a plan for future instruction. So what do I need to do with this student to help them in their areas of weakness? So now we move to what's going to happen in our classroom. And we know that in our classrooms we need balanced literacy or comprehensive literacy or whatever terminology you want to use. And we do that through the model of what's called the model of explicit instruction. In other words, we demonstrate reading and have students engaged in reading in several different ways or through several different components of a reading program. So first of all, we engage in modeled reading. In other words, we have lots of opportunity where the teacher is reading aloud to the student and explaining to them what they're doing in their head. And by the way, as we mentioned earlier, reading aloud and modeling fluent reading is one of the ways that we teach students the structure of the English language. But as you know, in read-alouds, we do read text and we often stop then and explain what's going on in our heads. So for instance, we might talk about how we figured out a tricky word. So those kinds of things. Then we engage in a guided practice, and we do this in two ways. We do this through shared reading and guided reading. So as you know, in shared reading, we're talking about an enlarged piece of text that a group of students or all of the students are reading and reading with the teacher. And in this model, the teacher is again demonstrating strategies, having the students practice the strategies. And the second part of guided practice, which is the piece we're going to go on to talk further about, is guided reading. And in guided reading, this is where we're working with small groups of students who are reading the same level of text, and we're also working with students who really need the same kinds of instruction. And then lastly, of course, there's the opportunity for independent practice, and this is where students then are applying the things we've been teaching through modeled reading and shared reading and guided reading. They model these and work with these things independently. And then at the very end, of course, students are then taking what they've been learning and applying it across other contexts or in other subject areas. So we're going to be very focused on looking at only one piece of the explicit instruction, and that's the guided reading. So that's where we're going to be really instructing for the areas of weakness that we've identified for various students. So what does guided reading enable us to do? Well, first of all, it allows us to differentiate the content. So in other words, what's being read. And as we saw in the PM Benchmark Kit, it allows us to identify students who are reading at a similar reading level. So we can look at, half a dozen students who need text at a level 12. We can be clustering those students together. It also allows us to differentiate how it's being read. So in other words, as you saw in the earlier examples of student A and student B, those students needed very different instruction. So one student really needed to focus on reading for meaning, and another student really needed to focus on reading for attending to visual cues. And then it also allows us to differentiate the product. So how might students demonstrate what they've learned? So guided reading really allows us to differentiate instruction to meet the needs of the various students in our classroom. So why do we have guided reading? So you may wonder why I'm heading off in the direction, kind of in a sense, away from the PM Benchmark Kit. But what I really want you to see is that the PM Benchmark is what allows you to know what to do in these guided reading groups. So we're now talking about the PM Benchmark really is an event that takes place, 2 or 3 times a year. But it's really guiding what you're doing every single day in that classroom based on what you find out about that student. So why guided reading? Well, it does allow our students to develop as individual readers, but they're participating in a social group, and we know how important social learning is. It gives us as teachers an opportunity to observe individual students and to provide support to them as they're working with text. It gives us readers an opportunity to develop the strategies using increasingly different texts. And it also makes reading enjoyable for students because we're reading text that's at the instructional level for them. In other words, text that they're going to be successful with, text that provide some challenges, but not at the frustration level. So what does guided reading look like within a comprehensive literacy framework? So as we talked about earlier, this is the typical setup of a comprehensive literacy classroom. Opportunities for read aloud, opportunities for shared reading. A lot of the time is taken up with teachers working with small guided reading groups, and then of course opportunities for students to do word work. In other words, to really look at vocabulary. So how is guided reading different than what we've been doing in the past? So one of the most important things is that guided reading is not round-robin reading. So if you think back to perhaps the days when many of us were in school, you know that we all had the same text and each of us stood up or we sat at our desks and we read out loud sections of the text. So that's not what guided reading is. Guided reading is not round-robin reading. In fact, when we're working in small guided reading groups, students are not reading the text aloud. They're sitting in the small group reading it silently to themselves, although, as you know, certainly grade 1 students, most of them can't read quietly to themselves, so they're whisper reading because you're going to hear them reading the text. And how is it different? Well, the teacher is going to select books for the various groups that reflect their reading level and reflect their instructional needs. So all the students in the class are not reading the same text. And perhaps most importantly, knowing that these groups are dynamic. In other words, unlike in the past when you started a reading group in grade 1, you pretty much stayed in that reading group your whole life. What we're saying here is that the groups change depending on what you find out from assessment and what the students need. So for instance, I may have a group of students who are reading text at a level 12, and they're all really focused on looking at using visual cues. But over time, some of the students may move on to the next level, and they may now have really met the need to look at visual cues. So they may no longer need to work with that particular group of students. Now I may focus on another strategy with them. So the most important thing is that we're constantly observing and assessing these students, and the groups are constantly changing based on their reading level and based on their need. It's important that every day your students have an opportunity to perform effectively as readers, and we do this by closely matching text to the readers in order to help them experience success in reading. In guided reading lessons, we really are providing a sequence of high-quality, engaging texts that support the progression in student reading. In other words, we continue to increase the level of difficulty of the student text, offering them more challenges, but never at the frustration level. So how are we going to group our students? Well, we'll place our students in groups by using your understanding that you gain from working with the PM Benchmark assessment tools. So you'll be looking at grouping students by strengths and needs. So in other words, students who have similar strengths and similar needs. By the difficulty of text, so we looked at the accuracy level to come up with the instructional level. And then we look carefully at the texts themselves to say, will this text support the student's progress? So we might be looking at things when we look at the text that, yes, it might be the right level of text, but it might be a topic that the student has no familiarity with. And we may decide not to use that text, or we might decide that this is a good time to introduce a novel concept to the student. So when we're looking at text for guided reading, when we're going to our book room or we're going to our classroom library, we're looking at all three of these things. What are the student's strengths and needs? What's the level of difficulty in the text? And will this text support the student's progress? Will this text allow me to prompt and support the students in the things that they need to progress as readers? So once again, and we've talked about this a little bit earlier, about the importance of that dynamic grouping in our classroom, that groups do not stay static. And we know this because there's really a wide range of experience and knowledge and skills among especially primary age children. And we know that every child is different in terms of their knowledge and skills, and we certainly found that out when we delivered the PM Benchmark assessment tools. But we also notice that our children are going to progress at varying rates. So some children will move through levels fairly quickly, and other children more slowly. Some children will gain the reading strategies that they need. They'll learn to cross-check and confirm more quickly than others. And what this means is that the children are constantly being grouped and regrouped based on ongoing observation and assessment. So while, yes, we delivered the PM Benchmark assessment tools, it gave us really a benchmark assessment. Where are the children now? We need to constantly be observing these children over time now, and we need to be continuing to use reading records when students are working in small groups. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we look at the steps of guided reading. In guided reading, the teacher's working with a small group. So usually the group size does not exceed 6. So 5 or 6 students is usually the ideal size for guided reading. The teacher selects an appropriate text for instructional purpose. So again, remembering going back to your PM Benchmark assessment tool, we're talking about a text that is in the instructional range. In other words, a text that the student can read between 90 and 95% accuracy. The teacher sets the purpose for reading. So it's important always that a student has a purpose for reading. So when we start the guided reading group, we'll talk about why we're reading this particular text. Each participant has a copy of text at their instructional level. So it's important that each student has their text in front of them so that they're reading at their own particular rate. The teacher introduces the text and supports the thinking and meaning by setting a purpose for each section. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but typically in guided reading, especially at the early levels, the text is chunked. It might be that you read a single page or a spread, or you read 2 or 3 pages and stop and talk about it before moving on. The students read individually and silently. And so again, as we talked about earlier, this is not round robin reading. Each student is reading the text to themselves. And the reason I say usually silently is because we know that students in very early reading cannot read inside their head. So they'll all, at your little table of 5 or 6 students, they'll all be reading it out loud. So we teach them to read in that quiet whisper voice. The other thing I'll mention here is that while the 5 or 6 students are reading quietly, what the teacher is typically doing is that this provides an ideal opportunity for assessment. So if you have a small group of 6 sitting around the table, as they're reading, you as a teacher can be sitting beside one student and listening to them read aloud and taking a reading record. So we don't just take reading records when we're using the PM benchmark. We really are taking reading records on students every day on an ongoing basis to know, what miscues are they making? Are they ready to move to a next level? So we're constantly taking those reading records. As the students are working with the text and reading the text, we're stopping throughout the text to discuss the text and to clear up misunderstandings and to talk about strategies we're using. We do ask students content and strategy questions, so it's not just about what the book is about, it's about, what did you do when you came to that tricky word? How did you figure that out? This is where we're constantly using those prompts that we had talked about earlier in the workshop. So we'll begin our guided reading group with 5 or 6 students who have similar reading levels and similar reading needs. And we've identified this by using the PM benchmark assessment tools. We'll meet with each specific group around a table, with each student having a copy of the text. We'll introduce the text to the students by providing background information and acquainting with them with perhaps some elements of the text, like structure or the content or the vocabulary or the plot. Now, again, remembering that this is different than we did in the PM benchmark assessment. When we're using text for guided reading, we do a book walk. We do introduce students to some of the new vocabulary. But remember that in the PM benchmark assessment, it's cold reading. In other words, we're not providing the student with any information about the text. They just start with that very short introduction and read. Because what we're trying to do in the PM benchmark assessment is to look at what are the strategies that the student is using without us providing any background information or any prompts to them. So the introduction to the text does not really involve reading the text to the students, but rather it's a conversation, a book walk that helps them to have the background knowledge they need to understand this particular piece of text. When our students are in their small guided reading group, we prepare them for reading the text. So we may do things such as introducing some of the key vocabulary. We might introduce some of the important phrases or some of the pictures that would introduce key concepts. So we might say to students things like, what comes to mind when you hear the words? Or have you ever experienced, to get them to talk about it. We might talk about the cover of the book. What do you predict the book is going to be about? So the whole purpose of this is to activate students' prior knowledge and to perhaps introduce some of the new vocabulary or maybe even a new structure of the text. And we also want to be very clear about setting a purpose for reading and reminding students to use the strategies. And this is where, as we talked about earlier, we might have some of those strategies and prompts posted on anchor charts near the guided reading group, so we can be referring to them both before we start the reading and during the reading. During the reading section of a guided reading lesson, it's important to remember that each student has a copy of the book and they're reading it silently to themselves. We chunk the text at strategic points in the text and have the students read that chunk silently, and then we'll stop and respond to questions about the text. Again, remembering that these questions might be questions about content and also questions about strategy. And while the students are reading that chunk of text silently, it's an ideal opportunity for the teacher to observe and support and assess individual students. So in the small guided reading group, you might be observing what a child is doing by having one child read aloud to you while the rest are reading silently. And you might be observing what they're doing. So again, you group these students together because they had particular learning needs. So you might be offering particular prompts to the students as they're getting stuck, or you might be asking them, what are you doing there to work out that tricky word? So you're always observing, supporting, and assessing. And during guided reading, it's an ideal opportunity for you to look at what individual students are doing. Why do we chunk the text into small sections? Well, one of the reasons is that students can keep the content in mind more easily when we read a chunk and stop and talk about it. It's easier for them to find and prove their answers because we'll often say to the students, ask some questions and then say, find the part in the text that tells you that. And shorter texts and shorter segments are really not as daunting to students who are perhaps struggling or reluctant readers. So the fact that I only have to read this one page and we'll stop and talk about it, sometimes that's a motivation for students who are reluctant readers. It also allows us as teachers to monitor and provide immediate support. So if they're only reading, a small chunk of text, we can immediately, work with a student who you can see is having difficulty rather than waiting until they're finished the book. And we can very quickly clear up student misconceptions or understandings or help them use fix-up strategies before they become frustrated or too confused. So after the student has finished reading, this is an opportunity to consolidate the strategy use. In other words, let's talk about what strategies we were using. Let's clear up any misunderstandings of the text. But what we don't want this discussion to be is an interrogation. So in other words, this isn't where we're basically interrogating the student about what they learned from the text. And again, I come back to the fact that we really want to ask some strategy questions and not just content questions. So we don't want to be only asking them about, who are the characters in the story? What problem did they have? How did they solve their problem? Instead, we want to be saying things like, find a part in the books that was tricky for you to read. What did you do to help you solve that? What did you try there that would make sense? So we're doing those kinds of things with the students. When they're finished reading, we'll ask them to go back to their seats or their tables or wherever they're working and do tasks that allow them to practice what we've just been scaffolding in this particular text. So remember, those students are together because they have similar learning needs. So if their need is on recognition of high frequency words, then maybe when they're finished reading that text and they might go back and do a group activity that focuses on things like reading around the room. So let's read all the high frequency words we see posted around the room. Or let's reread a text at an easier level so that we become more familiar with those high frequency words. Or they might play a card game where they're working with those high frequency words. So they're always, when they finish reading the text, they're working on activities that reinforce the strategies that we've been working on with that particular piece of text. I just included a few pictures to show you a little bit about things that you might see in guided reading in classrooms that have guided reading going on. So in the picture where you see the table with guided reading, what we're really looking at is somewhere that's in a quiet section of the room, and the students all have copies of their book. In this case, the teachers are using a kidney-shaped table, which is often used for guided reading, but really any table works. And what we want to make sure is that we've done practices in our classroom that teach the other students who are not part of their guided reading group not to interrupt when the guided reading is going on, save for an emergency. So, I've seen in primary classes where teachers use a little paper stoplight and they post the red light, and when the red light is posted, then students know that they ask other students for help or they wait until the teacher is finished. So teaching those management strategies. You'll also see in the bottom right corner, you'll see an example of how the guided reading groups are divided up in this particular classroom, what the rotation is. So if you're guided reading group number 4 from 9 to 9:20, you're working with the teacher. If you're guided reading groups 2 and 3, you're engaged in independent reading. And do remember what we learned from the PM Benchmark Assessment Kit. If students are doing independent reading, then we've provided them with books that are at the lower level, a level lower than what we're using in guided reading. And the students who are in guided reading group number 1, they're working at centers. And then you can see how that schedule just continues to change during the literacy hour. Probably the most frequently asked question about guided reading is, what are the other kids doing while I'm doing guided reading? And this is where the classroom management piece is really important. So it really is imperative that as a teacher that you develop routines and expectations for your students, and that they really know what to do while you're working with a guided reading group. And so we want to make sure that there are activities in our classroom that the students who are not working with you as a guided reading, in a guided reading group, are engaged in, and that these are not just busy work, things to keep them from bothering you when you're doing guided reading. So some of the things that you might be having the other students doing is they might be working on word work. So this might be things like, looking at high frequency words. It might be working on their own personal dictionaries. It might be doing things we've talked about earlier, things like reading around the room. So all those kinds of things that help them develop their vocabulary. They might be rereading. So in other words, once they've read a text in a small guided reading group, they should have the opportunity to reread that text many times. By rereading, it allows them again to practice their fluency. It allows them to become familiar with the vocabulary. They might be engaged in pre-reading activities related to the text they're going to read. So it might be a pre-reading activity that lets them become familiar with the content or playing with the vocabulary. Students can always be doing independent reading, so that's why our classrooms are often set up with book bins around the room, and they may be color-coded or in some way designate which books different groups, different guided reading groups should be going to. And again, remembering that those independent reading books need to be at a level lower than the books they're using in guided reading. Or children could just be practicing fluency by rereading text in a whisper voice. This is a sample rotation for guided reading, and again, please bear in mind that it's one teacher's thinking about how they work with their guided reading groups. So you'll notice that this rotation is talking about the frequency with which you might meet with various groups. So in this teacher's classroom, the group A students are the students who are requiring the most support, so they're the most struggling readers. The group B are the most capable readers in the class, and the middle group are the group C. So you'll notice again that based on the teacher's assessment of using reading records and things like retelling and comprehension, this is how the teacher has looked at their students. So if you look at group A, and group A is the group that's in red, and this is a 3-day cycle, so you're looking at day 1, day 2, and day 3, you'll notice that group A, you'll see on day 1 they have guided reading. You'll see on day 2 they also have guided reading. And you'll see on day 3 that they also have guided reading. So in other words, this group of students who need the most support, are the most struggling, the teacher fits in a guided reading with those students every single day. The students in group B, who are the most capable readers, and these are the students you'll see in the black font, you'll notice that in group B that they have guided reading with the teacher only once in the 3-day cycle. And then group C, which you'll see in the purple color, they have guided reading in the 3-day cycle twice with the teacher. So again, this is this teacher's way of working with the students, knowing that the students who need the most support and the most instruction with teacher guidance are the students who have guided reading every single day. Nelson has numerous resources to support your guided reading. I'll mention 3 series here. One are the PM Library, and it contains both fiction and non-fiction level text. The Nelson Literacy Guided Reading Kits also include fiction and non-fiction text, and Key Links, another series that has fiction and non-fiction text. So you'll find that in the Nelson resources, there are literally thousands of level texts to support the needs of your students. At a later date, we will be providing more information about each of these series. We'd like to thank you for joining us in this series of workshops. We hope that it has been helpful to you in both understanding how to use the PM Benchmark Kit and also how to use the data you've collected from the assessment tools to provide instruction for your students on a day-to-day basis. If you have any questions about either the kit or what you've seen on the workshops, please don't hesitate to pass them along to us. We'll be happy to follow up with you. Once again, I wish you well in your endeavors with your students.